Flash dispatch. Imperial embargo broken. Behind the towering wrought iron gates of Buckingham Palace and the heavily guarded sanctuaries of Clarence House, a devastating, unsanctioned coup is currently underway. A ruthless, quiet overthrow of royal tradition has breached the highest corridors of state authority, threatening to dismantle the moral foundation of the British crown. An illegitimate seizure of symbolic power has been set into motion, a cold, calculated plot designed to erase the memory of the most beloved royal figure in modern history and usurp the rightful standing of the future queen. This is not a matter of routine protocol. This is an illicit coup d'etat of emotional sovereignty, orchestrated in the deepest shadows of the realm where unbridled vanity collides with a fragile monarch's silent compliance. The air inside the private wing of Clarence House was suffocatingly cold. Prince William moved down the silent, velvet-lined hallway, his heavy footsteps muffled by the carpet, an unexplainable dread knotting in his stomach. He'd been summoned on short notice for what was framed as a routine administrative briefing concerning seating arrangements for the upcoming National Remembrance Service. But as he pushed open the heavy oak doors of the inner sanctuary, the complete absence of private secretaries immediately alerted him to a breach of court conduct. The room smelled of old leather, stagnant tea, and calculated treason. Seated at the head of the dark mahogany table sat Queen Camilla, her features set in a mask of rigid ambition. Resting directly before her, weight stamped by an official silver seal, lay a confidential ceremonial order bearing 3 words that caused William's heart to freeze in his chest: Princess of Wales. This was no accidental oversight. It was an act of raw, predatory aggression aimed directly at the heart of his family. Camilla had formally demanded the right to publicly wear and use the title of Princess of Wales as a secondary ceremonial style during the national service. In her mind, her marriage to King Charles III linked her to every title he had held as heir, believing state machinery could finally wipe away the public rejection that had haunted her for decades. But to William, those 3 words were sacred ground. They belonged eternally to his late mother, Diana, who had carried them through immense public adoration, crushing private heartbreak, and a catastrophic loss that still echoed through the realm. Now, they belonged solely to his wife, Catherine, who bore that legacy with humble dignity. To see Camilla reaching out to seize that title was an aggressive attempt to rewrite the emotional contract of the British people. William stood motionless, his eyes locking onto his father. King Charles pressed his trembling palms against the edge of the table, completely incapable of meeting his son's burning gaze.
"Did you know about this?" William's voice was dangerously quiet, stripped of all formal deference. The king hesitated. That agonizing, heavy pause hung in the air like a lethal sentence. It was a silence far worse than outright denial, exposing the devastating truth. Charles was not surprised by his wife's audacious request. He was only terrified that his son had discovered it before it could be finalized. Sensing the collapse of composure, a senior ceremonial advisor standing in the shadows stepped forward, his hands trembling as he confessed the ultimate betrayal. Drafts of the wording had already been secretly transmitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office. Camilla had not merely floated an idea. She had already activated the state apparatus to enforce her claim. With deliberate, icy precision, William picked up the supporting document. He scanned the dense pages detailing precedent, hierarchy, and constitutional entitlement. Princess Diana's name appeared nowhere. The omission was intentional and cruel, a calculated attempt to claim her identity by systematically scrubbing her memory from the official record. A dark, white-hot fury ignited within William. He stood tall, looming over the table, burning with an anger that shattered all courtly decorum. Looking directly at Camilla, he warned her that the title was not a meaningless antique waiting in an archive for an ambitious queen to claim. Camilla did not flinch. Her eyes remained cold as she delivered a brutal reply. History could not be held hostage by private grief. The atmosphere in the room cracked under the strain. Behind those 3 words stood the ghost of a tragic mother, a son fighting for her memory, a wife facing disrespect, and a wavering king whose indecision was morphing into outright betrayal. William realized that the crown was being compromised from within by a palace conspiracy that cared nothing for honor.
Refusing to negotiate away his mother's legacy, William folded the proposal, placed it back on the table with quiet, terrifying finality, and warned that he would tear the palace down before allowing this humiliation to proceed. Turning on his heel, he stormed out of the chamber, leaving the king in stunned silence and Camilla clutching the edges of her throne as the shadow of an irreversible war descended upon the House of Windsor. The drive back to Windsor Castle felt like a slow descent into cold, shadowed exile, the overcast sky reflecting the gloom over the royal household. Prince William stared into the gray mist, haunted by ghost-like memories of his youth. Standing in shadowed palace corridors as a boy, watching courtiers bow low before his mother, and hearing the cadence of her official title, Princess of Wales. To William, those three sacred words were never a sterile dynastic artifact or a decorative archival style. They were bound eternally to Diana's soft voice, her tireless humanitarian struggles, her private suffering, and the tragic loss that had stolen her away. To watch Camilla attempt to absorb that identity through cold administrative procedure was an act of emotional desecration he could never forgive. Inside the secluded private apartments at Windsor, Catherine listened without interrupting as her husband unspooled the details of the Clarence House ambush. She stood near the stone window, serene and motionless, but her quiet composure concealed an unyielding protective steel. Slowly, deliberately, her right hand moved to her left, sliding Diana's iconic blue sapphire engagement ring from her finger. She turned the heavy jewel once, twice, holding its cool weight against her palm while her eyes fixed on William. Her voice was remarkably steady when she asked her single, pivotal question. Had Charles approved it? William described the king's hesitant posture, his downcast eyes, and the feeble excuses that had followed in the tense silence. Catherine understood court intrigue instantly. The king had not drafted the audacious request himself, but his passive indulgence had granted Camilla the dangerous momentum she required. By telling his wife that the historical question deserved proper consideration, Charles had given her all the royal encouragement she needed to activate palace machinery and push her claim into the official realm. The conspiracy had ignited 6 weeks earlier during a private rehearsal for the National Remembrance Service in the palace music room. Camilla had been reviewing the commemorative tribute layout, placed upon a grand piano, when a single line of printed text caught her eye. Legacy of Diana, Princess of Wales, reading by Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her name was kept entirely separate from that legacy. The omission struck her like a public insult. When a senior ceremonial advisor timidly explained that the title had always been considered far too emotionally sensitive for her to wear, Camilla stiffened, her eyes flashing with cold resentment. "Sensitive for whom?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the silent, gilded room like a whip crack. Catherine had entered the music room before the tension could subside. Looking from the abandoned paper on the piano to the Queen's rigid posture, she grasped the situation immediately. Camilla declared that no single woman should possess a permanent monopoly over royal history. Catherine met her gaze, replying with quiet, absolute authority that memory was not a monopoly, and that true respect could never be seized through administrative cunning. Driven by humiliation, Camilla acted that evening, organizing a clandestine consultation with constitutional historian Sir Malcolm Avery to craft a legal loophole. When an exhausted Charles murmured, "Have it examined properly," he meant a cautious review. Camilla heard imperial permission. When William learned that Catherine had already faced Camilla's hostility in secret, his remaining restraint vanished completely. Bypassing private secretaries and court protocol, he marched directly into the king's private library at Buckingham Palace. He closed the heavy oak door himself, locking out courtiers, and thrust the unauthorized decree onto the mahogany desk between his father and the Queen. King Charles stood near the marble fireplace, his face pale, while Camilla remained seated, her expression locked in stubborn defiance. William closed the distance between them, his voice dropping to a low murmur as he delivered a devastating question. Was she truly prepared to wear his mother's title in front of his wife, his children, and a nation that still held Diana's memory sacred? Camilla rose so violently that her heavy chair scraped across the polished floorboards, creating a jarring shriek that pierced the silence. She spat back that she had endured decades of public hatred and silent exile to stand beside Charles, and she would not allow childhood grief to dictate the present or erase her place in royal history. But William stepped closer, eyes ablaze with fury. Grief had not written the revised program, he countered. Grief had not contacted the Lord Chamberlain behind Catherine's back, and grief had not attempted to rewrite history in secret. Turning to his father, William delivered a final decree. If this usurping claim moved forward by even a single step, he and Catherine would immediately boycott the National Remembrance Service. Their high-profile absence would trigger an unprecedented constitutional scandal, exposing the palace's rot to the world. Charles stared at his son in shock, realizing he had been backed into an inescapable corner. The king slowly picked up the folded proposal with trembling hands and admitted that formal authority, the Lord Chamberlain, would now have to decide the fate of the crown. The final authority now rested with the Lord Chamberlain, but the true burden crushed King Charles III as he sat alone in his private study late into the night. Spread across the mahogany desk were competing dossiers: Camilla's aggressive legal demands for ceremonial inclusion, constitutional briefings, and a single folded note written in Prince William's sharp hand. The king's eyes lingered on his son's handwritten plea, 12 words that cut deeper than any constitutional threat. "Please do not make me defend mother against you again." The sentence hung in the heavy silence like a tragic specter. To yield to Camilla would validate a predatory usurpation of memory, alienating his heir and casting a pall over the monarchy. To deny her would inflict devastating humiliation on the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scandal. A legal briefing from palace advisors had offered a fragile compromise, authorizing a narrow ceremonial style, recognizing Camilla's historical association with the Prince of Wales title during Charles's tenure as heir, without altering Catherine's absolute standing. But Camilla rejected it with venomous contempt. She refused to settle for watered-down legalisms like historically associated. She demanded the title itself, spoken aloud, desperate to extinguish Diana's phantom once and for all. For Camilla, anything less was confirmation that Diana's shadow still possessed superior spiritual authority over the realm. Faced with her refusal to compromise and William's absolute ultimatum of a public boycott, Charles knew the hour of delusion had passed. With a trembling hand, King Charles reached for his pen. He unlocked the official red dispatch box, retrieved the master decree, and signed his formal instruction across the parchment. The stroke of his pen was silent, but its reverberations shattered the palace balance forever. The king authorized a total rejection of Camilla's request. The Lord Chamberlain immediately halted the printing presses, purging every mention of the disputed title from the Remembrance Service programs. By sunrise, the quiet machinery of state had executed the king's mandate, but the true psychological reckoning remained to be delivered in person. Camilla received the sovereign decree inside a cramped reception room at Clarence House, far removed from courtly ceremony and without Charles present. The Lord Chamberlain stood in rigid silence as she unsealed the document. Her hands did not shake, but as she reached the final paragraph, her face drained of color. The ruling was absolute. It prohibited any use of the Princess of Wales title beside her name, confirmed Catherine as the sole living bearer of the rank, and decreed that future palace archives were barred from depicting Camilla as ever having held or claimed the title. The route was permanently, legally sealed. "Did William see this before I did?" Camilla asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The Lord Chamberlain replied with a single, devastating word: "No." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Charles had not been coerced in public by his son. He had consciously chosen to sacrifice her ambition to protect Diana's memory, Catherine's standing, and William's loyalty. When Charles entered her sitting room hours later, Camilla refused to rise for the sovereign. The king tried to explain that protecting the crown required pain, but Camilla cut him off with icy fury, accusing him of leaving her condemned as permanently unworthy. Charles could only stand before her in silent guilt as she realized the throne offered no shield against the judgment of history. Yet the final act of this drama unfolded when Catherine, Princess of Wales, walked into Camilla's private sanctuary completely unannounced, devoid of entourage or secretaries. Catherine requested the attending aide to close the heavy door from the outside, leaving the two most powerful women in the realm face to face in absolute isolation. There were no cameras, no dossiers, and no men to interpret their words. Camilla braced for a triumphal lecture from her rival, but Catherine's expression carried only solemn, unyielding resolve. Catherine broke the tense stillness, addressing the root of the madness. She acknowledged that carrying Diana's title brought not personal victory, but an immense weight of public scrutiny and comparison. Looking directly into the eyes of the Queen who had tried to dislodge her, Catherine stated plainly that memory was not a prize to be won through administrative deceit, and that dignity could never be restored to one woman by stripping it from another. The absolute clarity of Catherine's words pierced Camilla's armor. In that quiet, terrifying moment of honesty, Camilla broke, confessing her fear that Diana's phantom would forever mark her as an outcast. Realizing the futility of her crusade, Camilla picked up a blank card from the desk. With steady strokes, she penned a personal, binding statement. She accepted the king's ruling without reservation and swore never to seek ceremonial or historical use of the title again. She passed the note to Catherine, a voluntary surrender that transformed a bitter palace war into an undeniable triumph of justice. Catherine accepted the pledge with quiet grace, offering the Queen an honorable exit from public ruin. The forbidden title was secured, the usurpation vanquished, and as Catherine stepped out of the room, the shift of power was absolute. The future of the monarchy belonged to her. By the following morning, the private war that had threatened to tear the monarchy apart spilled into the public sphere as an unavoidable, seismic reckoning. Though the palace machinery attempted to suppress the details, fragments of the averted coup leaked to national broadcasters, triggering instant shockwaves across the country. Breaking news bulletins interrupted regular programming, while crowds began assembling outside Buckingham Palace and the gates of Kensington Palace in hushed, stunned anticipation. Official statements issued by the palace press office were cold and minimalist, confirming only that the ceremonial styles for the upcoming service remained entirely unchanged. Yet, behind those sparse, carefully scripted words, the nation understood that an invisible boundary had been tested and fiercely defended. Front pages across London displayed striking photographs of Diana alongside Catherine, cementing the public's absolute refusal to allow the late princess's identity to be eclipsed. At Kensington Palace, thousands of citizens gathered in silence, laying mountain piles of white roses and handwritten notes along the iron railings. One handwritten card, resting beneath a framed photograph of Diana, bore a message that captured the soul of the national mood. A title can pass, love does not. Watching the television coverage from his study, Prince William felt no triumph in the public outcry. Beside him, Catherine stood in quiet contemplation, her gaze fixed on the sea of flowers outside. The victory had protected his mother's legacy and secured his wife's rightful place, but it had laid bare the dark, fatalistic reality of their existence. Every symbol they carried, every title they held, was bought with past tragedy and maintained through eternal vigilance. The storm had ended, but it had left the royal family irrevocably changed, bound even tighter to the heavy chains of duty and historical memory. When the morning of the National Remembrance Service arrived, an oppressive, solemn silence hung over the cenotaph. The royal procession moved with mathematical precision, but the non-verbal signals among the principal figures spoke volumes to the observing world. Catherine stepped forward into her position as the sole living Princess of Wales, carrying the full, uncompromised majesty of her rank with effortless grace and quiet power. Beside the king stood Queen Camilla, her posture rigid, her eyes lowered, bearing the unmistakable mark of ultimate defeat. She had sought to rewrite royal precedent and seize symbolic absolute authority, only to find herself permanently contained within the strict boundaries of her existing role. Her political clout inside the court was shattered, her ambition broken against the immovable wall of dynastic necessity. For King Charles III, the day was a grueling trial of emotional survival. Standing in his full ceremonial uniform, the monarch appeared noticeably aged, carrying the heavy burden of a father who had been forced to choose between his wife's vanity and his son's righteous fury. In signing the decree that denied Camilla, Charles had saved the dynasty from a devastating public boycott and preserved the moral legitimacy of the crown. But the decision had carved a permanent rift within his private sanctuary. He stood as a tragic, transitional figure, a king caught between the unyielding shadows of the past and the rising, formidable power of his heir. He had maintained the order of the realm, but at the cost of his own domestic peace, realizing that sovereign authority is a lonely, unforgiving mantle. As the solemn trumpets sounded across the silent square, Prince William looked across at the Queen. There were no harsh glares or visible hostilities between them now. The war had ended, leaving only a cold, fatalistic acceptance in its wake. In her voluntary surrender, Camilla had accepted her place in the dynastic hierarchy, recognizing that some memories are too sacred and powerful to ever be conquered by court intrigue.
William understood that his mother's memory was no longer just a personal wound, but an eternal pillar of the constitutional order, a shield that would protect his wife and children for generations to come. The dangerous illusion that personal desires could supersede the ancient laws of the crown had been completely eradicated. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a new reality in which the balance of power had shifted forever toward the future king and queen. The forbidden title remained exactly where history, tragedy, and public devotion had placed it, not as a trophy to be claimed through ambition, but as a sacred boundary that the House of Windsor had finally learned to respect. The House of Windsor had survived another hidden earthquake, proving once again that individual ambition is always crushed beneath the relentless, unyielding gears of the monarchy. The crown endures, dark, majestic, and indifferent to human tears, claiming the lives of all who serve it. Thank you for watching this documentary script. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below.